They shared the same roof, not the same heart, until the Duke fell ill and called only her name. The winter light fell across the morning room like an accusation, pale, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to the silence it illuminated. Eleanor, Duchess of Renford, sat with her needlework positioned precisely as duty demanded, spine straight, fingers moving with practiced grace, her grey-green eyes fixed upon the linen, as though the stitches themselves might confess some truth her lips could never voice. Outside, snow had begun to settle upon the park in modest drifts, softening the austere lines of the topiary, as though even winter sought to gentle the extremities of this ancient house. Inside, there was no such mercy. The drawing-room remained rigidly beautiful, damask curtains drawn to preserve the furniture's colour, a fire maintained at disciplined temperature, every object arranged as though expecting inspection. She had learned, in the 3 years since her marriage, that beauty and coldness were not opposites in a gentleman's household. They were partners in the performance of respectability. "Your Grace." The voice came soft, but steady. Mrs. Broom, the housekeeper, stood in the doorway with the careful posture of one accustomed to never quite being acknowledged. Cook inquires whether the Duke will be dining at home this evening, or whether he will remain at his club as on previous nights. Previous nights. The phrase hung between them like a ghost wearing a smile. Eleanor's needle did not pause. She had long ago learned that hesitation was a form of honesty, and honesty was precisely what marriage to the Duke of Renford did not require. "His Grace will dine where His Grace finds most suitable," she said at last, her voice modulated to that particular register of wifely correctness, warm enough to appear dutiful, distant enough to suggest that such matters fell beneath the sphere of her concern. "Please inform Cook that preparations for 8 shall suffice, should he elect to remain here." Mrs. Broom's breath caught almost imperceptibly. In the servant's eyes, Eleanor saw the familiar compound of pity and bewilderment. The housekeeper had been at Renford Lodge for 30 years. She remembered when dukes had kept wives for warmth, not rooms. When the housekeeper withdrew, Eleanor set down her needlework with precision and rose to approach the window. The snow continued its patient descent, each flake a small mercy, erasing the winter's accumulated harshness. Somewhere in London, for Alistair never stayed at the country seat when the season permitted, her husband was conducting the business of dukedoms, the management of legacy, the careful orchestration of a reputation that admitted no softness. He had married her 3 years ago because the family needed an heir, and her bloodline, though modest, was unblemished. At the wedding breakfast, his hand had touched her elbow with precisely the degree of affection expected between strangers of good breeding. Their wedding night had been brief, courteous, and entirely devoid of the passion that novels, contraband things she had read as a girl, had suggested might occur between married persons. "It is sufficient that you perform your duties," he had told her afterward, whilst buttoning his waistcoat in the darkness. "I ask only that you maintain the household with propriety and provide me sons. We need not mistake obligation for sentiment, madam." She had answered, as she always did, with silence. Now, 3 years into her existence as his wife, Eleanor understood the true nature of their arrangement. She was the mistress of a house he rarely entered. She managed his correspondence, his household, his estates in his absence, performing with such quiet competence that he had never once found reason to compliment or correct her. She was, in effect, a magnificent piece of furniture, costly, well-maintained, and never quite noticed unless something went amiss. The snow swirled past the window panes, and somewhere in the distance, she heard the sound of the church bells striking the hour. Christmas would be upon them within a fortnight. There would be parish calls to make, charities to oversee, rituals of season and propriety to execute, and somewhere in London, Alistair would remain in the clubs and the commons, performing the great theatre of his dukedom, whilst she remained here, in the house they shared but did not inhabit together. A footman passed beyond the door, his footsteps muffled by carpet. Mrs. Broom's voice drifted from the hall, firm and practical, directing the daily machinery of the estate, with the authority usually accorded to the mistress herself. But Eleanor had learned not to assert such authority. Better to be invisible, efficient, beyond reproach. Better to be the kind of duchess whom no one thought to look at twice. She returned to her chair and resumed her needlework. The stitches fell into their rhythm, perfect, small, each one identical to the last. Each one a prayer, perhaps, though she had stopped believing that prayer could change the fundamental architecture of her life. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the fire burned at its prescribed temperature, and the house remained exactly as it had been yesterday, and exactly as it would be tomorrow, beautiful, silent, and profoundly, achingly alone. The post arrived mid-afternoon, as it always did, brought by the stable boy and sorted with ritualistic care by Mrs. Broom before being placed upon the hall table for distribution, according to rank and consequence. Most of it was addressed to His Grace, matters of estate and investment, and the 1,000 administrative details that constituted the life of a duke. These Eleanor placed in neat stacks for his eventual attention, though she never presumed to open them. One letter, however, bore the unmistakable seal of Mr. Benedict Crowhurst, the family solicitor, thick paper oxblood wax pressed with the mark of his office. It was addressed to Her Grace the Duchess of Renford, which was unusual enough to cause a small flicker of unease in her breast. She opened it in her private sitting room, where the afternoon light still held some warmth and the windows overlooked the gardens in their snow-mantled silence. My dear madam, I trust this letter finds you well. I take the liberty of writing to you concerning a matter of some delicacy, which I believe requires the attention of a sensible woman such as yourself. His Grace has been somewhat remiss in attending to certain financial provisions and inheritance matters of considerable moment. It is my concern as a devoted adviser to this house that should any matter of sudden consequence befall His Grace, illness, unforeseen circumstance, certain arrangements might be found wanting. I should desire to discuss with you in confidence those measures which might be taken to safeguard not merely the estate, but the reputation and stability upon which the future of Renford rests. I shall take the liberty of calling upon you at Renford Lodge on the following Thursday, at 2 o'clock, if such a time should suit your convenience. With sincere respect, etc. Eleanor read the letter twice, then held it to the fire, watching the paper blacken and curl. Crowhurst had always been a cipher to her, present at every important occasion, always correct, always solicitous, yet somehow managing to convey, in the most delicate manner, that she was precisely the sort of woman whom any sensible gentleman ought to mistrust, educated enough to understand the machinery of power, yet feminine enough to be naturally prone to sentiment and impulse. The implication was clear. He was coming to insert himself between her and any authority, to present himself as the true guardian of Renford interests, and to reduce her to a cipher even more complete than she already was. Your Grace? Mrs. Broom appeared in the doorway with that peculiar gift for timing that servants possessed. The housekeeper's eyes noted the ash of the letter still falling in the fireplace. A gentleman has called, Mr. Crowhurst. He was not expected, but he requested to wait, insisting he had news of some urgency. In the drawing-room, Crowhurst rose with precise courtesy, his thin face arranged in an expression of sincere concern. He was a man of perhaps 50, with the appearance of having been assembled with great care by someone determined to project respectability. His whiskers were perfectly groomed, his cravat immaculate, and his hands, those ink-stained hands, were hidden safely within the pockets of an impeccable coat. Dear Duchess, he said, bowing with just enough depth to suggest respect, without implying equality. I trust you will forgive my intrusion, but I have just come from London, where I have seen His Grace, and I confess to being somewhat troubled by the state of his health. Eleanor's spine straightened. His Grace appeared quite well in his last letter. Indeed, His Grace is always most steadfast in maintaining the appearance of vigour. It is a mark of his admirable constitution. Crowhurst settled himself with an air of having been invited to do so. However, I observed a certain pallor, a fatigue of the eyes that I thought might concern a devoted wife. The demands of Parliament, the weight of inheritance, if I may be candid, the anxieties that are often concealed beneath a gentleman's reserve, these matters take their toll. He paused, allowing his concern to permeate the silence like seeping water. Naturally, I say nothing of this to His Grace himself. A man of his standing must not be troubled with trivial observations. His smile was poisonous in its gentleness. But you, madam, as his wife, might be in a position to ensure that he maintains sufficient rest, that he does not overextend himself in the management of estates, whose complexity, I must say, has only increased with recent investments that perhaps were not entirely well considered. There it was, the barely veiled suggestion that Alistair's judgment might be failing, the implication that the household needed guidance beyond what he could provide, the clear assertion that Eleanor herself was being positioned as an instrument of his own influence. Mr. Crowhurst, she said quietly, you are kind to concern yourself with His Grace's health. I am certain he would appreciate your solicitude. As for the management of his affairs, I believe His Grace has always been entirely capable of making whatever decisions his judgment deems suitable. Of course, of course. Crowhurst's smile did not waver. And yet, madam, these are difficult times. The economy is uncertain. Inheritance laws are complex, and should anything unexpected occur, a sudden illness, an accident, it would be most unfortunate for decisions to be left unmade, for papers to remain unsigned, for the succession to fall into, shall we say, informal arrangements. In that moment, Eleanor saw with perfect clarity the architecture of the man's ambition. He did not seek to replace Alistair. He sought to replace her, to become the household's true authority, with herself relegated to the ornamental role of a widow managing estates, only until a son came of age. Every solicitude masked a reach for control. "I shall mention to His Grace that you have called," she said, rising to indicate that the interview was concluded. "I am certain he will wish to discuss these matters with you at his earliest convenience." Crowhurst departed with appropriate courtesy, but not before managing to suggest, in the most delicate manner possible, that her devotion to her husband's interests, however admirable, might ultimately prove insufficient to the complexities ahead. When he was gone, Eleanor stood at the window and watched the snow continue to fall. For the first time in 3 years, she felt something other than the dull ache of her marriage's coldness. She felt afraid. 2 weeks later, a letter came from London. Not from Alistair himself, he had never been a man for frequent correspondence, but from his valet, expressing in the most delicate terms that His Grace had taken ill, that a physician had been called, and that he would require several weeks' rest before returning to the country. The illness was described as a winter fever, nothing extraordinary, yet persistent enough to require withdrawal from public life until strength could be recovered. The letter was proper, measured and entirely devoid of urgency. It was the language of courtesy applied to discomfort, the vocabulary of a household trained to never admit that its master might be truly vulnerable. Eleanor read it 3 times, then carefully folded it and placed it in her writing desk. 3 days later, another letter came. This one from Alistair's physician, written to her directly, a gesture so unusual that it caused a cold shock to settle in her chest, even before she read the words. The fever had worsened. There was some inflammation of the lungs. His Grace was taking neither food nor sleep. The physician recommended that family be notified as a matter of precaution. A matter of precaution. The euphemism for dying. She did not tell the servants. She did not send word to Crowhurst or to any of their relations. Instead, she simply began to prepare. She ordered the carriage. She packed quietly. She left instructions with Mrs. Broom regarding the management of the estate in her absence, and by dawn of the following morning, she was on the road to London, wrapped in furs and silence, watching the frozen landscape pass beneath the windows. Drenford House on Belgrave Square was cold when she arrived, the kind of cold that only London townhouses achieved in winter, when the staff was reduced and only the most essential rooms were maintained. The butler who opened the door to her appeared genuinely startled. "Your Grace, we were not informed of your arrival. His Grace." "Where is His Grace?" she asked quietly. "The master's chambers, madam. He has been abed these 7 days. The physician was here this morning." "I shall alert—" "Do not alert anyone," she said, already moving toward the stairs. "I shall require hot water and clean linens, and I shall require them immediately." When she reached his chamber, she paused only briefly before entering. What she found there shocked her in ways she had not anticipated. Alistair lay in the vast marriage bed, not the separate chamber he ordinarily maintained, and he appeared diminished in a way that had nothing to do with his physical form. His face was flushed and damp with fever, his eyes closed, his breathing labored, and beside the bed, untouched, was a small brass bell. She approached slowly, as one might approach a wild thing that might startle. She had not stood this close to her husband since the day of their wedding. His hair, usually so perfectly disciplined, lay dark and disordered against the pillowcase. His nightshirt clung to his shoulders, damp with perspiration. And when she reached for the bell to summon the servants, his eyes opened, unseeing at first, then gradually finding focus. For a moment, there was confusion in his gaze. Then recognition, but not of his wife. Recognition of someone present in the room, a shape against the firelight, something tangible in the fever's dark architecture. "Eleanor?" The word came as a whisper so faint she almost did not hear it. His hand rose from the coverlet, trembling. "Eleanor, But fever took him again, and his words dissolved into delirium, and she was left standing beside the bed, watching her husband, the man she had been married to for 3 years without ever truly meeting him, call for her name as though it were a prayer he had never permitted himself to voice aloud until sickness made him honest. She sat down in the chair beside his bed and began to wait, understanding with sudden and painful clarity that this illness, this crisis, this moment when pride became impossible and need became inescapable, this was the hinge upon which the entire architecture of their marriage would turn. The first night was a descent into a landscape Eleanor had never traversed. She remained in the chair beside the bed, whilst the household, uncertain and increasingly alarmed, moved through the rooms like actors who had lost their scripts. A nurse was summoned, a brisk woman named Miss Hartwell, who regarded Eleanor with the cool professionalism of one accustomed to managing both patients and interfering family members. Yet even Miss Hartwell, after observing Eleanor's quiet competence, her willingness to change linens and cool the fevered forehead and simply sit in the darkness without complaint, seemed to understand that here was not a woman who could be dismissed. "The crisis will come within 48 hours, Miss Hartwell said quietly, as she prepared another cooling compress. "Either the fever will break, or—" She did not finish. There was no need. Eleanor nodded and resumed her vigil. She had sent no word to the estate. She had not informed any of their relations or the society that would normally expect notification of a peer's illness. She had simply remained, present, constant, in the way that wives were supposed to remain in the marriage vows, though she suspected few marriages actually achieved such presence. Around midnight, Alistair's delirium deepened. He spoke in fragments, his voice sometimes commanding and clear, sometimes reduced to whispers that seemed to come from very far away. She heard him address individuals she did not know, his father, dead these 15 years, men who sounded like colleagues from Parliament, and again in the fever's honesty her own name. "Eleanor would not," he said at one point, thrashing against the coverlet. "I have been most correct with her, most proper. She understands the nature of our arrangement." But then, minutes later, in a voice so broken it scarcely sounded like him, "Why did I not? Why was it not possible to— Eleanor, Eleanor, I am sorry." She did not know what he was apologizing for. Perhaps he did not either. Perhaps fever had simply revealed the shape of every unspoken regret, every word that propriety had forbidden him to voice, whilst consciousness provided the excuse of dignity. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, as the house settled into that profound silence which only London nights achieved, his fever seemed to peak. His skin burned beneath her cool hands. His eyes, when they opened, held a wild brightness that seemed to burn with an almost supernatural intensity. And he reached for her, not grasping, but with a kind of desperate precision, as though he were trying to hold on to something that was slipping away. "You came," he said, his voice clearer than it had been in hours, though the words were barely audible. "I thought, in the fever, I was not certain if you were real, or if I had only imagined you. But you came." "Yes," she whispered, because any other response seemed a cruelty. "I am here. Do not let me—" His eyes closed, and for a moment she thought he was lost again to delirium, but his grip on her hand tightened. "Do not let me become the kind of man who dies having never said what was true." And then the fever took him again, and he was lost in a landscape of his own making, and all she could do was hold his hand in the darkness and understand that she had been married to a stranger, and that this stranger, in the extremity of sickness, was finally, terribly, becoming real. When dawn came, Miss Hartwell examined him with the brisk efficiency of her profession. "The fever has not broken," she said. "We may hope for improvement within the day," but she did not complete the sentence. There was no need. It was then that Crowhurst arrived. He came mid-morning, presenting himself with the solemnity appropriate to calling upon a dying man. His eyes noted Eleanor's presence with something that might have been concern, or might have been calculation. She was no longer certain of the difference with him. "Your Grace," he said, bowing with precise respect. "I came as soon as I received word of His Grace's condition, a most unfortunate circumstance. I trust the physicians are hopeful." "The crisis comes today," Eleanor said quietly. She had not left Alistair's room except for the most necessary purposes. She was acutely conscious of her appearance, her hair partially undone, her dress wrinkled from a night spent in a chair, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, and something deeper than mere sleeplessness. "We are waiting." Of course, of course." Crowhurst positioned himself near the window, managing to convey both deep concern and a subtle command of the space. "During such times, it is most important that a household be managed with sound judgment. I have taken the liberty of reviewing certain documents ensuring that his Grace's affairs remain in order, should circumstances require it. The implication was clear. He was positioning himself to assume control. "I believe," Eleanor said slowly, "that his Grace's affairs are his concern, not yours, Mr. Crowhurst. And should his Grace be unable to attend to them himself, I am his wife. The decisions fall to me." Crowhurst's smile remained unchanged, but something flickered behind his eyes, a recalibration of his estimate of her. "My dear madam, whilst your devotion does you credit, surely you must understand that matters of estate and inheritance are rather beyond the sphere of—" "Of what, Mr. Crowhurst?" She turned to face him fully, and perhaps it was the exhaustion, or perhaps it was the terrible clarity that comes from sitting beside the sickbed of someone you have been married to without ever truly knowing them, but her voice was steady and without apology. "Beyond the sphere of a wife. I have managed this household for 3 years with complete competence. I understand the accounts, I understand the estates, and I understand my husband's intentions regarding his affairs far better than someone who visits only when there is advantage to be gained." The silence that followed was profound. Crowhurst's expression did not change, but she saw the moment when he recognized that she was not, after all, merely an ornamental duchess to be managed and manipulated. "I remain naturally at his Grace's service," he said coolly, "should he require my counsel." "I shall inform him of your call," Eleanor said, turning back toward the sick room, "when he is well enough to receive visitors." When Crowhurst had gone, she sat again beside Alistair's bed and took his hand once more. The fever still burned in his skin. The crisis was still to come, but in that small moment of confrontation, she understood something profound. She had been made invisible by circumstance and by her own acceptance of invisibility. And if he died, if fever took him, she would not permit herself to die alongside him into obscurity. She would remain, she would bear witness, she would be seen. The second night was worse than the first. The fever seemed to consolidate its grip, drawing every ounce of strength from Alistair's body, leaving behind only the ghost of the man he had been. Miss Hartwell maintained her professional composure, but Eleanor could see the grim acknowledgement in her eyes. This was the moment when survival became a matter of will rather than constitution. Around 11 o'clock, as the house settled into its deepest darkness, Alistair's breathing changed. It became shallow, irregular, as though his lungs were forgetting their work. Eleanor rose and went to summon Miss Hartwell, but the nurse was already awake, already moving with practiced swiftness toward the sick room. "Fetch the physician," Miss Hartwell said quietly. "Now." The servant who had been dozing in the hallway departed at a run. Eleanor returned to her chair, and for the first time in 2 days and nights, she allowed herself to contemplate the reality of what was happening. Alistair was dying. This man whom she had been married to without truly knowing, for whom she felt a complex tangle of resentment and obligation, and, she could admit it now, at the edge of his dissolution, a profound, terrible love that had grown not from passion, but from proximity, from 3 years of service, from the simple and utterly human act of being present. He had called for her in his fever, not for his solicitor, or his colleagues, or the machinery of his dukedom, for her. The physician arrived within the hour, a man named Dr. Ashford, grey-haired and grave. He examined Alistair with a thoroughness that seemed to take an eternity, whilst Eleanor stood motionless, watching the rise and fall of the fever-racked chest that might at any moment cease its labour entirely. "The inflammation of the lungs is progressing," Dr. Ashford said at last, his voice the particular tone reserved for delivering knowledge that no one wished to receive. "There is pneumonia settling in. The fever has become the body's attempt to fight an infection that may exceed its capacity to overcome." "Is there nothing to be done?" Eleanor heard herself ask, as though from a great distance. "We can apply mustard plasters. We can attempt to cool the fever further. We can pray." The physician's eyes were not unkind, but they held the exhaustion of a man who had delivered such news too many times. "Beyond that, madam, we are in the hands of Providence." When he had gone, Eleanor sat down once more and took Alistair's hand. His skin was burning. His pulse, when she found it at his wrist, was rapid and fluttering, as though his heart was trying to escape from the fever that held it captive. She thought of their wedding day, of the polite distance he had maintained, of every meal eaten in separate rooms, of every night spent in separate chambers. She thought of how she had learned to be invisible, to make herself so small and so useful that her own wants and needs had become as irrelevant as the furniture, and she thought of how, in the delirium of fever, he had called for her, not for the role she played, but for the woman herself. "Alistair," she whispered, and it was the first time in 3 years that she had spoken his Christian name aloud, without formality, without the mediation of title and propriety. Alistair, do not leave. Do not leave whilst there is still time to speak what needs to be said. For a long moment there was no response, and then, almost imperceptibly, his eyes opened. They were clearer than they had been, as though the fever had burned away the confusion and left only the essential man beneath. "You are here," he said, and his voice was different, softer, stripped of the careful authority that had always armored it. "I am not dreaming." "No," she said, "I am here. I came when I learned you were ill. I have not left your side." His eyes, searching hers, seemed to contain a question too profound to voice. "Why?" The single word held universes of confusion. "You have no obligation beyond what duty demands. You could have remained at the estate, left my care to the servants, conducted yourself with appropriate distance." Eleanor found in that moment that the careful architecture of her reserve, built over 3 years of marriage to a man who did not know her, was no longer sustainable. Or perhaps it was simply that fear of death was a more honest teacher than pride had ever been. "Because," she said quietly, "I could not bear the thought of you dying without knowing that someone chose to stay. Not because of duty or propriety or the machinery of marriage, but because your absence would diminish the world in a way I could not endure." The tears that fell were her own, though she could not say precisely when they had begun. She reached up to touch his fever-dampened forehead, and he turned his head slightly to press his lips against her palm. A gesture so tender, it broke something in her chest that had been locked away for 3 years. "Forgive me," he whispered, "for every coldness, for every distance I maintained, for treating you as though you were less than necessary, when the truth—" His eyes closed, exhaustion claiming him once more. "The truth is that you were always everything that made this house a home." And in the darkness of that sick room, with death waiting in the shadows and fever still burning in his blood, Eleanor understood that sometimes love does not arrive with the fanfare of passion. Sometimes it arrives quietly, with the patience of water wearing stone, and it takes a crisis of mortality to make clear what has been true all along. The fever broke at dawn. It was not the sort of thing that happened in the novels she had read as a girl. No sudden transformation, no dramatic moment of clarity and recovery. Instead, it was a slow and subtle thing. Eleanor woke from an exhausted doze to find that his skin, which had burned with the intensity of coals, had cooled to something approaching normal. His breathing, which had been shallow and labored, had deepened into something that suggested genuine sleep, rather than the restless torment of fever. Miss Hartwell examined him with professional care and permitted herself a small nod of something that might have been satisfaction. "The crisis has passed," she said quietly. "Whether he will recover fully, whether there will be complications, these are matters yet to be determined, but he has survived the turning point. The body's defenses have prevailed." The physician, when he came an hour later, seemed almost surprised to find his patient still living. He examined Alistair with the particular care reserved for patients who had somehow defied expectation, and declared that whilst recovery would be slow and complete rest essential, there was every reason to hope for a full restoration of health. It was only then that Eleanor permitted herself to truly breathe. The following days unfolded in a strange and novel rhythm. As Alistair's strength gradually returned, so too did his awareness of his situation and of her presence. The first time he was fully conscious, truly lucid, without the fever's distortion, he regarded her with an expression of profound confusion. "You have not left this room," he said. It was not a question. "No," she replied simply. "I have not." "For how long?" 3 days and nights." He closed his eyes, and she watched the muscles of his jaw tighten. "You should have remained at the estate. Your place is there." The household is managed by people quite competent to manage it," she said, and there was a note in her voice that made him open his eyes once more. "My place, I have come to understand, is wherever you are. That was the vow I made, though I confess I did not fully understand its meaning when I made it." He was quiet for a long moment, his dark eyes searching her face as though seeing her truly for the first time. "In the fever," he said slowly, "I spoke. Miss Hartwell has been kind enough to inform me that I was not entirely coherent. I hope I said nothing that caused you distress." "You called for me," Eleanor said quietly. "Often, not as a duchess, not as the mistress of your household, but as Eleanor, as though I was someone whose presence mattered to you beyond the obligations of marriage." The color rose in his face, whether from residual fever or from something else, she could not determine. "I have been a poor husband," he said at last. "I have been so concerned with maintaining propriety, with keeping my own heart guarded as though weakness were contagion, that I failed to see that I had married not merely a duchess, but a woman of remarkable strength and grace." "Alistair," she said, and again the use of his name without formality seemed to shift something between them. "You were raised to believe that feeling was a luxury, that emotion was the province of those too weak to master themselves. You were not cruel. You were simply afraid." "Of what?" he asked quietly. "Of needing someone," she replied. "Of admitting that the machinery of duty and propriety was not, in truth, sufficient to sustain a human heart." He reached for her hand, and this time it was not the grasping of delirium, but the deliberate gesture of a man who was choosing to abandon the distance he had maintained for so long. "In the fever," he said slowly, "I dreamed that I had always loved you, that perhaps beneath the coldness I maintained, some part of me recognized what my pride would not admit. Does that seem impossible?" "No," she said, and she brought his hand to her lips and held it there. "It seems like the simplest truth there is." Over the following week, as his strength increased enough to permit conversation beyond the bare necessities of his recovery, they began to talk. Not about the estates or the management of household affairs, but about the things that had remained unspoken. She told him about the cold rooms and the careful dinners served in separate chambers. He told her about the loneliness of responsibility, the weight of never being able to admit need or weakness, without risking the respect upon which his authority rested. "I had constructed a prison," he said one afternoon, as she sat beside him whilst he took a weak broth that Miss Hartwell deemed essential to his recovery, "and made myself both jailer and prisoner, and I invited you into it, expecting you to flourish in captivity. Instead, you accepted your confinement with grace, when I should have been building a home worthy of your presence. You are building it now," she said softly. "We are building it now, together. That seems sufficient." It was on the 10th day after the fever's breaking that Crowhurst called once more. He found Alistair sitting in a chair by the window, still visibly weakened, but undeniably present and in command of his faculties. And he found Eleanor beside him, her hand resting lightly upon his shoulder in a gesture of such quiet possession that even Crowhurst seemed to recognize that the architecture of control he had been constructing had, during his absence, been entirely dismantled. "Your Grace," Crowhurst said, bowing with his customary precision, "I am most gratified to see you recovering so admirably. I have, during your illness, taken the liberty of attending to various matters of estate, ensuring that nothing was left wanting." "Thank you, Crowhurst," Alistair said coolly, "but such matters have been ably managed by my wife. In fact, I find upon examination that her judgment regarding several investments and arrangements has been considerably more sound than my own previous decisions. I believe the time has come for me to entrust her with greater authority regarding the household management. You may direct all future matters of estate through her." If Crowhurst was surprised by this pronouncement, he managed to conceal it behind his usual mask of respect. But Eleanor felt the shift in the room, the subtle acknowledgement that she was no longer invisible, no longer relegated to the periphery of her own life. When Crowhurst had left, and Alistair had settled back into his chair with obvious exhaustion, she bent and kissed his temple gently. "You need not have done that," she said. "I do not require authority or title to be content." "I know," he replied, taking her hand and holding it against his heart. "That is precisely why you deserve it. Come Christmas, we shall return to Renford. And this time, my wife shall not sit alone in the morning room whilst her husband conducts his life in distant rooms. This time, we shall inhabit the same house, and perhaps, God willing, the same heart." The journey back to Renford Lodge took place on a morning when winter had settled over the English countryside with the finality of a judgment that could not be appealed. The carriage, well sprung and carefully maintained, carried Alistair and Eleanor through landscapes rendered austere by frost and snow, whilst servants followed in a second conveyance bearing trunks and the accumulated necessities of their London sojourn. Alistair remained weak. The physician had been explicit in his warnings regarding overexertion, but he refused to travel separately from his wife, and Eleanor, having long ago abandoned the pretense that her preferences were matters of indifference, had arranged the journey to accommodate his need for rest without the humiliation of his being treated as an invalid. They spoke little during the hours of travel, but the silence between them was no longer the cold and isolating thing it had been. Instead, it was companionable, punctuated by small gestures, her adjusting the blanket across his lap, his reaching for her hand when the carriage lurched over a particularly rutted section of road. The brass handbell, retrieved from London at Eleanor's insistence, sat wrapped in cloth on the seat opposite them, a talisman of sorts, a symbol of the intimacy that had been forged in fever and nearly lost to death. "When we arrive," Alistair said as the carriage approached the lodge's gates, "I wish to make a statement to the household regarding your authority. I wish to ensure that there is no ambiguity regarding your place in the management of the estate." "Is such a statement necessary?" Eleanor asked gently. "I have never doubted my place, and the servants require no formal declaration to understand the reality of their situation." "Nevertheless," he replied, and there was a note of something like defiance in his voice, "I wish the world to understand that I do not keep a wife as one might keep a beautiful painting, something to be admired from a distance and never truly regarded. You are the heart of this household, Eleanor. I wish that truth acknowledged and recognized." Mrs. Broom was waiting in the hall when they entered, and the housekeeper's eyes, upon seeing Alistair leaning heavily upon Eleanor's arm, widened with something between alarm and something deeper, a recognition, perhaps, that the cold architecture of the household had been fundamentally altered. "His Grace," Mrs. Broom said, curtsying with appropriate formality, "welcome home. We have maintained the household in your absence, though." "I am certain you have maintained everything impeccably," Alistair said, and his voice carried the particular warmth of genuine gratitude rather than the distant courtesy she was accustomed to. "Mrs. Broom, I wish to inform you, and through you the entire staff, that during my recent illness, my wife demonstrated a devotion to duty and a capacity for judgment that exceeds, by considerable measure, anything I might have expected. Henceforth, Her Grace's authority regarding household management is to be regarded as equivalent to my own. Any matter that would ordinarily be brought to me may equally be brought to her, and her decisions in such matters shall be treated with the same respect and obedience as you would accord to me." The housekeeper's expression shifted, became luminous almost. She curtsied more deeply. "Your Grace will find that Her Grace has already demonstrated such qualities most admirably. The household has never been more efficiently or thoughtfully managed. It is a privilege to serve under her direction." In the quiet that followed, Eleanor felt something settle within her. Not the triumph of having won a victory over Alistair's coldness, but something far more profound. She had been seen. She was being acknowledged. After 3 years of invisible service, the labor of her hands and heart were being recognized as worthy of respect, rather than mere expectation. Over the following days, as Christmas approached with its attendant demands and ceremonies, the household seemed to undergo a subtle transformation. The servants moved with greater alacrity, not from fear, but from genuine engagement with a mistress who now wielded her authority with quiet confidence. The drawing rooms were arranged with particular care. The kitchens produced meals of increasing refinement, as though the cook too had understood that the household was no longer merely being maintained, but was being elevated into something approaching its true potential. Eleanor found herself occupied with the 1,000 details of preparing Renford for the season, the ordering of decorations, the arrangements for the parish calls that would inevitably come, the preparation of the rooms that would receive visiting relations and various members of the local gentry. Yet unlike the solitary labor she had previously undertaken, these tasks now had Alistair's collaboration, his suggestions, his evident interest in the way she transformed the austere house into something that might, charitably, be described as warm. "I have been blind," he said one afternoon as they stood in the great hall, which was now threaded with garlands of holly and decorated with candles that cast their light across surfaces that had seemed to accept only shadow. "I had accepted that a household of our standing should be beautiful, but never beautiful for any purpose beyond the display of wealth. I did not understand that beauty might serve the purpose of comfort, that elegance might be an expression of care rather than merely a demonstration of power." "You were not blind," Eleanor said, adjusting one of the garlands with careful hands. "You were simply occupied with other matters. The world of commerce, of politics, of inheritance and title, these things demanded your attention in ways that the interior of your own home did not. I have had the luxury of fixing my attention here because my sphere was here. Now perhaps we might share both spheres." "I should like that," he said quietly. "I should like very much to be a husband who understands both the mathematics of estates and the language of his wife's heart." It was on the afternoon before Christmas Eve that Crowhurst called. The solicitor presented himself with his customary courtesy, but something in his demeanor had shifted. He was aware, clearly, of the transformation that had taken place during his absence. The household was no longer a domain divided between an absent master and a decorative wife. It had become unified, directed by a partnership that seemed, in its quiet way, formidable. "Your Grace," he said, bowing to Alistair with somewhat less confidence than previously. "Her Grace, I trust I find you both well. I had hoped to discuss certain matters of estate that require your attention." "You may direct such matters through my wife," Alistair said calmly. He was seated beside the fire, still recovering but manifestly in command. "I find myself increasingly occupied with matters of rest and recovery, and Her Grace has demonstrated a capacity for such business that exceeds my own. Unless the matter is one of truly exceptional consequence, I prefer to delegate such concerns to her capable hands." Crowhurst's smile thinned. "Naturally, I defer to your judgment, Your Grace. However, certain legal matters are perhaps best handled by a solicitor working in consultation with my wife," Alistair finished. "I am certain you will find her counsel both sound and thorough. You are dismissed, Crowhurst. Her Grace will receive you again when she deems it necessary." The dismissal was courteous but absolute. When Crowhurst had withdrawn, looking distinctly diminished, Eleanor placed her hand upon Alistair's shoulder, a gesture of such natural affection that it seemed to surprise them both with its ease. "You need not have been quite so direct," she said gently. "He has served your family for many years. He has served his own interests whilst cloaking them in the language of loyalty," Alistair replied, "and he sought to render you invisible because invisibility served his purposes. I will not countenance such behavior, not any longer. You are the Duchess of Renford, Eleanor, not as an ornament but as a true partner in all that this household comprises. It is time that everyone, including yourself, understood that truth." Christmas Eve arrived with the particular magic that winter could bestow upon a house that had chosen to receive it. The great hall at Renford Lodge had been transformed into something approaching a place of wonder. Garlands of holly and ivy traced the walls, candles burned in every available fixture, and a fire of such magnitude roared in the great hearth that the entire space seemed suffused with amber light and warmth. The local gentry had been invited for the traditional Christmas Eve gathering, a custom that Alistair's father had instituted some decades previously and which had continued, though in recent years with a certain mechanical quality, as though it were an obligation to be satisfied rather than a genuine expression of hospitality. This year, however, something was different. The house seemed alive, animated by a joy that was manifestly authentic rather than performed. Eleanor moved through the rooms in a gown of deep midnight blue, trimmed with silver thread that caught the firelight like starlight. The colour was not ostentatious, but neither was it the pale and self-effacing hues she had previously preferred. It was a colour chosen by a woman who understood her own worth and was no longer willing to diminish it for the comfort of others. Her hair was arranged with greater care than usual, and there was a luminosity to her face that seemed to have nothing to do with the cosmetics she had eschewed in favour of simple confidence. Alistair, though visibly still in the process of recovery, had insisted upon receiving guests. He remained for most of the evening seated in a position of particular prominence, yet not isolated, as a recovering man of his rank might ordinarily be, but with Eleanor constantly beside him, her presence so natural and so integral that it seemed to redefine the entire architecture of the evening. As the night deepened toward midnight, a moment arrived that would, in the months and years following, become a part of the local legend regarding the Duke and Duchess of Renford. The assembled guests had been summoned into the great hall for the final portion of the evening's festivities. The servants had distributed wassail in silver goblets, and the company stood, as was traditional, to offer toasts to the season and to the house's prosperity. It was then that Alistair, with deliberate ceremony, rose from his chair, an act that required considerable effort and that seemed to command the attention of every person present. Eleanor rose with him, her hand supportive beneath his arm, yet he gently withdrew from her grip and stood alone, swaying only slightly despite the obvious toll such an act of will demanded. "I have asked you here," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd with the authority of one accustomed to commanding attention, "to celebrate Christmas and to honor the traditions of this household, but I find myself moved to make a statement that transcends the merely ceremonial." A silence fell. That particular quality of silence that indicated the gathering understood that something significant was about to occur. "3 weeks passed," he continued. "I was brought to the threshold of death by fever. During that passage through darkness, I experienced something that many men live their entire lives without truly understanding." He paused, and his gaze found Eleanor across the space that separated them. "I experienced the meaning of love, not as passion, not as the romantic sentiment celebrated in verse, but as the deep and abiding knowledge that another person's presence is the only thing that makes existence bearable. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. This was not the sort of thing the Duke of Renford said. This was not the sort of thing proper aristocrats acknowledged in public. During my illness, Alistair continued, my wife came to me, not because duty demanded it, but because her heart demanded it. She remained by my sickbed for days and nights without rest. She challenged those who sought to diminish her place in my household. She demonstrated a strength, a courage, and a capacity for genuine love that put my own carefully maintained reserve to shame. He extended his hand toward Eleanor, and she crossed the space between them, her movement graceful and without hesitation. I wish, he said, taking her hand and bringing it to his lips, in a gesture so tender that several of the assembled ladies appeared on the verge of tears. Publicly, and before all these witnesses, to acknowledge that I have been blessed beyond measure in my marriage, that my wife is not merely the Duchess of Renford by title, but by virtue of her extraordinary character, and that I am in every meaningful sense a man transformed by the love of a woman I had the infinite foolishness to underestimate for 3 long years. He drew her close, and in that moment, with the firelight catching the silver in her hair and the warmth of the great hall surrounding them, he pressed his lips to her forehead, a gesture that was formal in its restraint, yet which somehow contained more genuine affection than any passionate display could have conveyed. The applause that followed seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. In the days that followed Christmas, as the holiday season settled into the quieter rhythms that preceded the new year, Renford Lodge seemed to exist in a state of particular grace. The visiting relations gradually departed, the local gentry resumed their ordinary lives, and the household returned to its customary operations, yet fundamentally altered, as though it had been remade in a moment of public recognition that nothing could now reverse. Alistair's recovery progressed with increasing rapidity. The physician, when he called to examine his patient for what was expected to be the final formal consultation, remarked with evident satisfaction that he had rarely encountered a patient with such powerful motivation to heal. The doctor, it seemed, had not failed to notice that the Duke spent virtually every hour in the company of his wife, nor that the improvement in his spirits seemed directly correlative to the quality of her presence. Yet there remained in Eleanor's mind a small unease that she could not entirely articulate. The public recognition, the dramatic declaration before the assembled gentry, the physical affection he now demonstrated, these things were real, she did not doubt it. Yet they seemed to exist in a realm somewhat removed from the intimate quiet of their private hours together. She wondered sometimes whether the transformation that had occurred in the fever's crucible would prove durable, or whether, as his strength returned and the demands of his position reasserted themselves, the carefully constructed walls might begin to rebuild themselves. It was on the evening of the 28th of December that Alistair came to her sitting room, the private chamber that she had always occupied alone, surrounded by books and needlework and the accumulated small things that constituted her interior life. He carried with him the brass handbell, which had been carefully preserved since his recovery, and his expression was one of such deliberate seriousness that Eleanor set down her pen and gave him her complete attention. I have been thinking, he said without preamble, about the nature of my recovery, about the moment when I called for you, when only your voice seemed capable of anchoring me to reality. About this small object, he held the bell aloft, which became, in my delirium, the symbol of permission to need you. He sat beside her, and his movements, though stronger now, still carried the deliberate care of one whose body remembered its recent proximity to death. I wish to propose something, he continued, something that may seem peculiar, yet which I believe speaks to a truth that we have discovered about ourselves and about what genuine partnership might mean. He placed the bell in her hands. I wish for this bell to remain in our private chambers, not as a symbol of summons as though you were a servant to be called at will, rather as a reminder to us both that we have the right, the sacred right, to call upon one another when we are in need, not from obligation, but from genuine desire for the other's presence. Eleanor held the bell, feeling its weight in her palms. It was such a simple thing, yet the meaning contained within its small brass form seemed to encompass everything they had learned about love and vulnerability, and the courage required to truly know another person. Do you understand what I am proposing? He asked quietly. I think so, she said. You are suggesting that we acknowledge explicitly and continually that we need one another, That need is not a weakness, but the deepest expression of love. Yes, he said, and more than that. I am suggesting that we build our life, our remaining life, God willing, upon the foundation of that acknowledgement, that we do not retreat into propriety and distance now that the crisis has passed, that we remain always as we became in those dark hours, present to one another, honest with one another, willing to call and willing to answer. He reached for her hand and placed it over his heart. I am still afraid, he admitted, and the confession seemed to cost him something. I am still inclined toward reserve, toward the maintenance of distance as a form of protection. But I am more afraid of losing you, of returning to the cold architecture of what our marriage was before, than I am of the vulnerability that love demands. Eleanor leaned forward and kissed him, a gesture she had only recently allowed herself to initiate, and which still carried the novelty of an extraordinary rebellion against 3 years of restraint. When she drew back, her eyes were bright with tears, though whether they were tears of sorrow or joy, she could not have said. "Then we shall answer one another," she said softly. "In sickness and in health, in pride and in humility, we shall answer one another's call, not because we are required to do so, but because we choose it. Every single day, we shall choose it." He drew her into his arms, and in the quiet of her sitting room, with the fire burning low and the winter darkness pressing against the windows, they held one another in silence. A silence that was no longer cold or isolating, but rather the profound quiet of two people who had discovered that home was not a place but a person, and that the greatest courage was not the maintenance of distance, but the willingness to be truly known. Outside, snow began to fall once more, soft and silent, covering the grounds of Wrenford Lodge in its patient, forgiving blanket. And within the house, in a room illuminated by firelight and warmed by something far more essential than mere heat, the small brass bell sat upon the table, waiting, not for a summons, but for the moment when one of them would reach for it, knowing that the other would answer, that they would always answer, that the distance between need and love had been forever bridged. The new year arrived with that particular quality of renewal that winter, despite its apparent harshness, always seemed to offer. January had settled over the estate with clear, crisp days that followed bitter nights, and Alistair, now substantially recovered, had taken to walking the grounds in the late afternoon, his arm invariably linked through Eleanor's, as though the physical connection had become essential to his sense of equilibrium. The household had evolved into something that the servants, with their intuitive understanding of such matters, had begun to describe simply as happy. It was not a word ordinarily associated with grand estates and the formality that typically surrounded aristocratic life. Yet there was no other adequate description for the way the Duke and Duchess moved through their days together, the way her presence seemed to lighten the natural gravity of his demeanor, the way he looked at her as though he could not quite believe his good fortune in having been granted a second chance. "I have been corresponding with my physician," Alistair said one afternoon as they walked along the frost-covered pathways of the gardens. "He believes that within a month I may safely resume my duties in Parliament. The thought fills me with an unexpected ambivalence." "You fear returning to London?" Eleanor asked, though she suspected she knew the truth. "I fear," he admitted slowly, "that the demands of that life may draw me back into the patterns from which your devotion has rescued me. I fear becoming the man I was, the man consumed by duty and appearance who confused the maintenance of distance with the maintenance of honor." Eleanor paused in their walking and turned to face him fully. "Then do not return to being that man," she said simply. "Return to Parliament, yes, your responsibilities demand it, but return as the man you have become, the man who understands that love and strength are not opposing forces, but rather partners in the creation of something meaningful." He drew her close, unconcerned with the possibility that a servant or tenant might observe them from some distant vantage point. "I had thought that such transformation required a lifetime, yet you have taught me that sometimes the most profound changes occur in a matter of hours, when we are stripped of all pretense and forced to confront the truth of what we truly are." Over the following weeks, as Alistair's strength consolidated and he began gradually to reassume the various responsibilities that had accumulated during his illness, something remarkable occurred. Rather than drawing away from Eleanor into the sphere of his professional life, he seemed instead to draw her toward him. He consulted with her regarding matters of estate. He shared with her the correspondence from London. And he returned from the parliamentary business with evident eagerness, as though the day's work was merely the interval between departures and returns to her company. It was Mrs. Broom who, in the quiet way of housekeepers, first mentioned to Eleanor that there were whispers among the servants regarding her condition. It took a moment for Eleanor to understand what the housekeeper was delicately indicating, and when comprehension came, it arrived with such profound joy that she found herself unable to speak for several moments. "You are certain?" she asked at last. "As certain as such matters may be," Mrs. Broom replied, her expression radiating a happiness that transcended professional boundaries. Dr. Ashford, when he made his final call, expressed his satisfaction regarding your improved health and suggested that the pregnancy was progressing most favorably. He appeared to believe that His Grace was already aware. "I have not yet informed him," Eleanor said quietly. "I wish to be absolutely certain before speaking it aloud. Somehow, the speaking of it makes it real in a way that mere knowledge does not." That evening, as they sat together in the small parlor that had become their preferred refuge, Eleanor found herself struggling to articulate something that, once spoken, would transform the architecture of their future in ways both wonderful and terrifying. Alistair, perceptive as he had become to the subtleties of her emotional landscape, noticed her hesitation. "What troubles you?" he asked, setting aside the correspondence he had been reading. "Do you have that particular expression of someone bearing significant news?" "Not troubles," she said slowly, "but rather something that requires confession and which may require you to expand your understanding of joy even further than you have already done," she told him, and she watched his face as the meaning penetrated, the dawning comprehension, the moment when it transformed into profound wonder, and finally into something approaching transcendent happiness. He rose from his chair and drew her up to stand beside him, and he placed his hand very gently upon her still flat abdomen, as though he might feel through the fabric of her gown the presence of the new life that was forming there. "A son," he said, and his voice held such certainty that Eleanor could not help but smile. "Perhaps," she said, "or perhaps a daughter. The future, for once, is genuinely uncertain." "Then we shall meet that uncertainty together," he replied, "as we have met every other challenge, with honesty, with courage, and with the absolute certainty that whatever comes, we shall face it as partners in the truest sense." He kissed her forehead and then her lips, and in that gesture was contained the recognition that their lives had shifted entirely from the cold performance of duty into something far more precious, the genuine and unguarded expression of love between two people who had discovered that the greatest strength was not the maintenance of distance, but the willingness to be vulnerable together. Spring came to Renford Lodge as it always did, gradually then suddenly, as though winter had been holding its breath and had finally released it in an explosion of green growth and returning light. The gardens, which had been austere under snow, began to soften with the emergence of early flowers. The air, though still cool, carried within it the promise of genuine warmth to come. And within the house, a subtle but unmistakable energy of anticipation seemed to animate even the oldest, most established routines. Eleanor's pregnancy progressed with a health that Dr. Ashford pronounced exemplary, a word he seemed to use with particular satisfaction given the tribulations of the previous winter. She carried the child with a grace that seemed to astound everyone who observed her, moving about the estate with undiminished energy, managing the household with unaltered competence, and manifesting none of the delicate weaknesses that society sometimes expected of expectant mothers. Alistair, meanwhile, had undergone his own transformation. The man who had been trained to view sentiment as weakness and feeling as liability had become someone entirely different, someone who spoke openly of his joy regarding the coming child, who attended to his wife with a solicitude that fell just short of excessive, and who seemed, to everyone who encountered him, to be undergoing a kind of spiritual renewal that transcended the merely physical recovery from illness. "I have been thinking," he said one afternoon in late April, as they sat in the garden room overlooking the grounds now green with new growth, "about the kind of parent I wish to become, about what legacy I wish to leave this child, not in terms of title or wealth or the machinery of inheritance, but in terms of the understanding of what it means to be human." "And what have you concluded?" Eleanor asked, her hand resting gently upon the swelling of her belly where the child moved with increasing frequency. "That the greatest gift I can offer is to demonstrate, through my own life, that love is not weakness, that admitting need is not shameful, that the most important inheritance I can leave is the knowledge that a marriage built upon genuine partnership and mutual regard is far more valuable than any estate or title." He paused, watching her with an intensity that still, even now, caught her breath. I wish our child to know that their father was capable of recognizing his limitations and their mother was remarkable enough to inspire his transformation. Our child will know, Eleanor said softly, because we shall teach them through the example of our lives. Not through words alone, but through the way we move through the world together, the way we choose each day to answer one another's needs. It was in the second week of May that Mrs. Broom approached Eleanor with a proposal born of her observation that the Duke and Duchess had become something of a subject of local speculation and, in certain circles, of considerable admiration. There is to be a gathering, the housekeeper said delicately, of the parish charity committee. Traditionally, such gatherings have been somewhat formal, somewhat lacking in warmth. But I wondered, Your Grace, whether you might consider hosting the gathering here at Renford, whether you might use it as an opportunity to demonstrate to the community the transformation that has occurred in this house, not through announcement, but through simple example. Eleanor and Alistair exchanged glances, and in that glance was contained a complete conversation, a mutual understanding that here was an opportunity to extend the grace they had discovered in their private life into the larger sphere of their social responsibilities. We shall do so, Eleanor agreed, and it shall be an event that demonstrates not merely the resources of Renford Lodge, but the kind of community we wish to help foster, one based not upon hierarchy and distance, but upon genuine regard and shared purpose. The gathering, when it occurred on a perfect May afternoon, became something of a watershed moment for the local community. People observed the way the Duke attended personally to the comfort of his guests. They noted the way the Duchess, heavy with child yet manifesting no discomfort, moved among the community members with genuine interest in their welfare and circumstances. They witnessed in small moments and gestures a model of partnership that suggested that perhaps the rigid hierarchies and distances that typically characterized aristocratic life were not, after all, inevitable or necessary. Word, as it always did in small communities, traveled, and the story of the Duke and Duchess of Renford, the man whose pride had nearly destroyed his marriage, and the woman whose quiet constancy had redeemed it, became something approaching local legend. Not the stuff of scandal, but rather a narrative of hope, suggesting that even the most intractable distances might be bridged through love and courage. As summer approached, and the child within her grew toward the moment of arrival, Eleanor stood often in the gardens at Renford, one hand resting upon her belly, the other held by her husband, and understood that she had been given something precious beyond measure. Not merely a marriage transformed, but a life fully inhabited. Not merely love, but the daily tangible recognition of being beloved. The nursery at Renford Lodge had become, in the 5 years since the arrival of their first child, a place of remarkable liveliness. 2 children now occupied the rooms, James, who bore his father's dark eyes and his mother's gentle temperament, and little Eleanor, who had arrived 2 years after her brother, and who seemed to have inherited the spirits of both parents in equal measure. A third was on the way, though with the contentment that comes from parents secure in their love and confident in their capacity to nurture life. On this particular morning in May, 5 years precisely from the day that Alistair's fever had broken and their lives had begun their extraordinary transformation, the household was in the quiet throes of preparation for a significant event. The Duke and Duchess of Renford were hosting a gathering that had begun to be spoken of in political and social circles as something approaching revolutionary in its implications. They had established, in the grounds of Renford Lodge, a school, not the sort of institution designed to educate the privileged alone, but rather an experimental establishment dedicated to the notion that education, like love, was not a commodity to be rationed according to social status. Children of tenant farmers studied alongside the children of minor gentry. Girls received instruction in disciplines previously reserved for boys, and the entire endeavor was overseen by a board of governors that included not merely aristocrats, but representatives of the local community whose practical wisdom had proven invaluable in shaping the school's philosophy. The inspiration for this project had come, unsurprisingly, from Eleanor. But what distinguished it was the wholehearted participation of Alistair, who had thrown himself into the work with the intensity and passion that had previously been reserved entirely for the machinery of inheritance and political influence. Together, they had created something that transcended their personal transformation and had become a genuine force for change in their community. This morning, they stood together at the great window of the drawing room, watching as carriages began to arrive. Local magistrates, members of parliament, educational reformers, and representatives of the press, all arriving to observe what some were beginning to describe as an experiment in enlightened governance and social responsibility. The children played on the lawn below, their voices carrying up to the adults who watched with various degrees of bemusement, admiration, or thinly veiled skepticism. "Do you remember," Alistair said, his hand finding Eleanor's, "the morning when you arrived at my sickbed in London, when you sat beside me in the darkness, and I was uncertain whether you were real or merely fever's delusion?" "I remember everything," Eleanor replied. "I remember the terror of nearly losing you. I remember the clarity that came when I understood I would have sacrificed everything to keep you alive. I remember the moment when the fever broke and you opened your eyes and truly saw me. I see you still," he said quietly. "Every single day I am astonished by what I see. Not merely the woman who saved my life, though you did, not merely the mother of my children, though you are that with extraordinary grace, but the woman who refused to accept my coldness as inevitable, who understood that beneath the armor of duty there might be a man capable of love, who had the courage to call that man forth into the light." Below them, young James was teaching his sister the names of birds, his voice carrying up with the particular clarity of childhood. Eleanor, predictably, was asking why and how and what for, demonstrating the inquisitive nature that both her parents recognized and treasured. "They will change the world," Eleanor said softly, "not because they are our children, but because they are being raised in a world where love is not deemed weakness, where partnership is not deemed aberration, where the capacity to feel is not treated as a liability to be overcome, but as a gift to be cultivated." The first of the guests was being ushered into the drawing room. Parliament members, philanthropists, individuals with the power to shape policy and public opinion. They came to observe the school, to understand the philosophy that drove it, to assess whether it represented genuine innovation or merely aristocratic sentiment divorced from practical reality. What they would discover over the course of the day was something more fundamental than either hypothesis. They would see a duke who spoke about educational reform with the passion of a man who had experienced profound transformation. They would see a duchess who moved through discussions of pedagogy and social responsibility with an intellectual rigor that put many of the assembled gentlemen to shame. And they would see, most significantly, children who were being educated not merely to think but to feel, to understand compassion, to value community, to recognize that the greatest strength was not the maintenance of distance from others, but the willingness to engage authentically with the world around them. As the morning progressed, Eleanor found herself in conversation with a journalist from one of the better-known London publications. The man was asking questions about the origins of the school, about what had inspired the Duke to embrace such progressive thinking. "It was not the school that was the beginning," Eleanor said carefully, "but rather something far more personal. My husband experienced a profound illness several years ago. During that illness, everything he had built his life upon, his pride, his distance, his understanding that power derived from the maintenance of emotional reserve, all of that became not merely irrelevant, but actively harmful. He had to learn, in a very short period of time, that the greatest strength comes not from never needing anyone, but from the courage to admit need and the wisdom to recognize when someone is offering you grace." The journalist was leaning forward, clearly perceiving that there was a story here that transcended the merely political. "And you," he said carefully, "you were the instrument of this transformation." "No," Eleanor replied with characteristic precision. "I was simply present. I remained constant. I refused to accept his coldness as inevitable. That willingness to insist on connection, on genuine regard, that was not extraordinary. It was simply what love demands, when love is true." By the time the day had drawn to a close and the guests had departed, many of them, it seemed, genuinely moved by what they had witnessed, Alistair and Eleanor found themselves alone once more, standing in the nursery where both children slept peacefully, unaware of the significance of the day that had just concluded. "Do you know what strikes me most profoundly?" Alistair said quietly, watching his daughter sleep with that expression of wonder that had never entirely faded. "It is that my near death was not a tragedy to be regretted, but rather a gift I did not know I needed. Had I remained healthy, remained in control, remained in the cold architecture I had constructed, I would never have discovered that life could be so much richer, so much more meaningful, when lived in genuine partnership with another person." He drew Eleanor close, and they stood together in the soft lamplight of the nursery, watching their children sleep. understanding that the greatest legacy they would leave was not a school or a reformed estate, or any of the outward manifestations of their transformed life. It was the simple and revolutionary knowledge that love, when freely given and openly received, had the power to remake not merely individual lives, but entire worlds. The brass handbell, preserved now in the private chambers they shared, would eventually be passed to James, along with the story of what it meant, how a simple object had become the symbol of a promise made in darkness and kept in light. It would remind him, and his children after him, that the greatest strength was the willingness to need, and the greatest love was the willingness to answer that need without hesitation or reservation. 5 years after the fever, 5 years after the near loss that had transformed everything, Alistair and Eleanor had discovered that the promised land was not somewhere distant, requiring endless struggle to reach. It was here, in the quiet moments, in the daily choice to remain present to one another, in the courage to let themselves be truly known, and in that discovery, they had found not merely a marriage restored, but a life made whole. Love does not always arrive dressed in the garments of passion. Sometimes it comes quietly, wearing the humble clothes of constancy and care. Sometimes it requires silence before it can speak truth. Sometimes it demands that we strip away the armor of pride and propriety to reveal the trembling heart beneath. The greatest tragedy is not to love without return, but to live beside someone for years without truly seeing them. The greatest victory is not to conquer another's heart through force or beauty, but to create the conditions wherein both hearts can finally speak their honest need. In this story of a Duke and Duchess, separated by the very roof that sheltered them, we learn that marriage is not a contract signed and then forgotten. It is a daily choice, a choice to remain present when absence would be easier, to speak when silence would be safer, to call to another person with the knowledge that you yourself might be called upon. It is the courage to admit that you are not sufficient unto yourself, that you require another's presence to be wholly human. The fever that nearly took the Duke was not a cruelty of fate. It was a mercy, an insistence from the universe that some truths cannot be postponed indefinitely, that some distances cannot be maintained forever, that the walls we build to protect ourselves often succeed only in imprisoning us. And the Duchess, who lived in invisibility and silence for 3 years, teaches us something equally profound, that constancy need not be rewarded to be worthy, that service performed with grace becomes in itself a form of power, that the woman who tends the fire, who maintains the household, who holds her tongue in propriety, she is not weak. She is the bedrock upon which everything depends. And when she finally speaks, when she finally claims her place, the entire architecture of the world adjusts to accommodate her truth. This is the lesson of the small brass bell. It teaches us that permission to need is not shameful, that asking for presence is not weakness, that the vulnerability which we have been trained to hide is, in fact, the gateway to genuine connection. In our world of endless distance, separated not by cold rooms, but by glowing screens and endless distractions, we would do well to remember these two people, who discovered that the greatest luxury is not having everything we desire, but rather having someone who will answer when we call. Call to action. Dear listeners, have you experienced a moment of transformation as profound as the Duke's? Have you discovered, as Eleanor did, that constancy and presence can be forms of quiet power? We would deeply love to hear your thoughts about this story. Please subscribe to our channel to be notified whenever new tales of Victorian romance arrive in your life. And leave a comment sharing what resonated most with you, whether it was the journey toward love, the power of vulnerability, or the belief that it is never too late to transform your life. Tell us, what did the Duke and Duchess teach you about love, about presence, about the courage it takes to be truly known? Your voices matter, your stories matter, and your support helps us continue creating these narratives of redemption, transformation, and the quiet, fierce power of love. Subscribe, comment, share this story with someone who might need to remember that love asks for presence, and presence in the end is the greatest gift we can offer. With deepest appreciation and profound gratitude, we thank you for spending these precious hours with us, accompanying the Duke and Duchess through their journey from coldness to connection, from isolation to intimacy, from the architectural distance of duty to the warm embrace of genuine partnership. On behalf of the entire team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories, we offer our sincere thanks for your time, your attention, and your heart. You have been part of something beautiful today, a story that reminds us all that love, when true, is worth every risk, every vulnerability, every act of courage it demands. May you find, in your own life, someone worthy of your constancy. May you have the courage to call out, knowing that you will be answered. And may you remember always that the greatest strength is not the maintenance of distance, but the willingness to let yourself be loved. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. Thank you for being part of our Victorian romance community. With warmth and endless appreciation, the team at Victorian Romance Audio Stories